I knew he was leaving before Benjamin even said a word. There was something in the way he tidied his small belongings around the house, in the deliberate way he folded the shirt he never bothered to fold, in the heavy silence that filled the spaces between us. I wanted to believe it was just another fight, another temporary distance that time would heal, as it had so many times before. But there was a gravity in his movements that morning that told me, clearer than any speech, that this was different, that he had finally grown tired of us. I watched from a distance, sitting at the edge of the couch, clutching a cold coffee mug between my hands as if it could anchor me somehow. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask him to stop. I didn't cry. I just sat there, motionless, while the man I loved packed his life into a worn suitcase, as if everything we had shared could be reduced to a few clothes and a handful of hastily folded memories. The clock on the wall ticked like an unrelenting judge, each second carving a sentence I didn't want to accept. Benjamin avoided my eyes, and I avoided my own voice, choking back the words that begged to escape, words I had sworn I'd never say again. Don't go. Not now. Not like this. We were two silent battlefields, each defending our pride as armor, while the quiet war between who we were and who we could have been consumed everything around us. Maybe this was for the best, a cold voice in my head said. Better to let him leave without a fight. Better to preserve what little dignity remained. But there was another voice, faint and persistent, born deep in my chest. A voice that whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth saving. When he zipped the suitcase and ran a tired hand through his hair, time seemed to slow. I felt my entire body tense, as if the simple act of sitting there doing nothing was draining me bit by bit. And then, without rehearsal, without control, I heard myself speak. My voice trembling, almost childlike, breaking the thick silence of the room. Stay. Just one more day. The words came out small, almost invisible, but they echoed between us like a restrained thunderclap. Benjamin froze, his hand still on the suitcase's zipper, and for the first time in a long while, he looked directly at me. In that gaze, there was so much pain, longing, exhaustion, and a faint spark of something I thought we had lost forever. Love, perhaps, or its memory. There were no promises, no grand speeches, just a hesitation, a deeper breath, a half step back, like someone who still doesn't know whether to stay or go. And in that moment I understood. Sometimes love doesn't win with epic battles or perfect words. Sometimes love wins with a simple plea, with one more day, with the fragile courage of someone who still believes something can be rebuilt from what seemed irretrievably lost. He didn't say anything right away. He just left the suitcase leaning against the door, as if suspending a decision and, with it, his own breath. I didn't move. I was afraid that any gesture might shatter the delicate balance of that moment, as if one wrong step could push him out of my life forever. Benjamin walked to the kitchen with heavy steps, turned on the faucet, let the water run, and stood there, motionless, staring into the void, as if hoping to find an answer that we both knew wouldn't come easily. I watched him from a distance, feeling the entire room pulse with a dense, suffocating tension. Everything I wanted to say, everything that had been choked back during months of misunderstandings, hung in the air like a silent storm. And for the first time, I didn't try to pretend I didn't feel it. The day dragged on with the heavy slowness of moments that matter too much to go unnoticed. We did everything with excessive care. Breakfast, an improvised lunch, even the silences between tasks were carefully filled with minimal gestures, as if we feared a wrong word could collapse what, by a fragile thread, still bound us. Benjamin didn't mention leaving again, and I didn't ask. There was an unspoken agreement between us. Just exist in that day. Just share the same space. even if it was for the last time. In the afternoon, he sat in the backyard with a book he didn't even open. I stayed in the kitchen, drying dishes that were already dry, listening to the sound of the breeze and the noise of the world outside that felt so distant from the reality we were living. I looked out the window and saw Benjamin staring at the sky, as if searching for courage in the clouds. It was in that moment that I realized he was as scared as I was. It wasn't a lack of love that pushed him away. It was fear. Fear of repeating old mistakes. Fear of getting hurt again. Fear of discovering that sometimes even the deepest love isn't enough if courage is lacking. And understanding that, seeing his fear mirrored in mine, tore through me with such overwhelming tenderness that my hands trembled just trying to hold it. The sun began to set, painting everything in a melancholic golden hue, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't try to fix what was broken with hurried words. I didn't try to be stronger than I was. I just allowed myself to be there, wholly vulnerable, wholly waiting. If he left the next day, I would know that this time I hadn't stayed silent. I hadn't let love die without a fight. And maybe just that was already a victory. Night fell like a heavy veil over the house, and every minute seemed to prolong the wait for an answer that still hadn't come. We prepared dinner in silence, like two ghosts who knew every inch of that kitchen, but now felt like strangers within it. The sound of pots, the creak of the wooden floor, even the crackle of the stove seemed louder, more present, filling the gaps left by the words we didn't have the courage to say. Benjamin moved slowly, as if each gesture required a strength he wasn't sure he still had. And I, holding my breath, fought the urge to ask what he would decide at dawn. I knew instinctively that it wasn't the time to press, that just one more day was a thread too delicate to be pulled with desperation. We sat at the table face to face, like two islands separated by a sea of everything we had been and everything we still feared becoming. We ate little, almost nothing, more to fulfill a ritual than out of real hunger. Sometimes our eyes met for brief seconds, and in those glances, there was more history than 1,000 conversations could carry. Memories of nights of laughter, fights laced with love, mornings when a single touch was enough to know that despite everything, there was still an us there, stubborn, surviving the cracks of time. When I finished my plate, I lingered longer than necessary clearing the dishes, washing each one with exaggerated care, as if delaying small acts could also delay the decision hanging in the air like a dormant sentence. Benjamin stayed seated, watching me with that tired expression, but filled with something I didn't dare name, hope perhaps, or longing for what we were before everything became so hard. It was he who broke the silence, finally, when the night seemed to have taken over everything. In a hoarse, low voice, almost as if speaking to himself, he said, "I never imagined it would be so hard to leave." The words were simple, but they pierced me like a fine blade. And before I could respond, before I could ruin everything with the weight of my anxiety, he stood slowly, picked up the forgotten suitcase in the corner of the room, and, without saying more, took it back to the bedroom. There were no declarations, no immediate embraces, no dramatic tears. Just the sound of the suitcase being dragged across the wooden floor, and then the creak of the mattress as he sat on the edge of the bed, like someone finally accepting to stay a little longer in a place that still feels like home. I went to the hallway and, through the half-open door, saw Benjamin lean his head back, eyes closed, as if finally letting the exhaustion collapse. And in that moment, without promises, without certainties, I knew he would stay, at least for one more day. And sometimes, one day was all we needed to begin rebuilding what we thought was lost forever. The next morning, when I opened my eyes, the first sensation that hit me was strangeness. For a second, I thought I had dreamed it all. The plea, the moment Benjamin carried the suitcase back to the bedroom, the hesitation that silently turned into staying. But then I heard the muffled sound of the kettle in the kitchen, smelled the faint aroma of fresh coffee wafting through the house, and realized it was real. He was still there. Not because I had trapped him with grand words or desperate promises, but because somehow my simple plea had touched something inside him that neither pride, nor exhaustion, nor even fear had managed to bury completely. I got up slowly, as if afraid to scare away the miracle still lingering in the air. When I entered the kitchen, Benjamin had his back to me, absently stirring sugar into his mug. He didn't say anything when he saw me. He just pulled a second mug from the cabinet and filled it with coffee, sliding it towards me like someone offering more than a drink, like someone offering a gesture of peace, of restarting. I thanked him with a small nod, and in that moment I realized words weren't necessary for now. We had talked so much in the past, shouted, argued, tried to stitch wounds with phrases that never quite fit. Now what we needed was exactly this: space, time, the chance to relearn how to exist side by side without the weight of the past crushing the present. The day unfolded as if we were walking on a tightrope, suspended between two worlds, who we had been and who we might still become. We went for a walk around the neighborhood, a walk that in other times would have been trivial, but now felt laden with invisible meanings. Our hands nearly touched a few times, by accident or restrained desire, but neither dared to cross the still fragile distance between us. We talked about simple things: the weather, the neighbor's dog, the new cafe that opened down the street, and strangely, it was in these unassuming topics that I found what I had long been searching for: the certainty that there was still life between us. A simple life, without grand gestures, but pulsing, real, possible. At night, as we washed the dishes together, our arms occasionally brushing in the cramped kitchen space, I felt an almost painful urge to freeze that moment, to hold it in my chest like a living photograph, a reminder that it was still possible, that we still existed somehow, even after everything. Benjamin, with a tired smile, that rare smile he only showed when he let all his defenses down, teased me about how I still insisted on organizing the dishes by size. I laughed, for the first time in a long while, a laugh that came out light, genuine, without the shadow of fear. And it was in that laugh, in that moment so small and yet so immense, that I realized that just one more day was changing us. It was giving us back, little by little, to ourselves. The following days were a silent extension of that first plea. One more day turned into 2, 3, an entire week in which we learned, like two survivors in a ravaged land, to recognize the solid ground beneath our feet. It wasn't easy. It wasn't magical. There were moments when the weight of who we had been seeped between us, like invisible cracks, threatening everything we were trying to rebuild. Sometimes, in the middle of a trivial conversation, a painful memory would surface without warning, a misplaced word, a lingering glance, and silence would stretch between us again like an old wall resisting being torn down. But somehow, we stayed there, persisting in each other, perhaps because we knew that even with all the scars, it was here that we still made sense. On a cloudy afternoon, as we walked along the road leading to the lake, Benjamin stopped suddenly, staring at the horizon as if searching for something he couldn't name. When I said his name, he turned to me with an expression that blended pain and hope in equal measure. And with a sincerity that completely disarmed me, he said, "Sometimes I still wonder if we didn't go too far in hurting each other." The words hung between us, heavy and inevitable. I felt the tightness in my chest, the urge to deny, to assure him that everything could be perfect now, but I held back. because there was truth in what he said. We had deep wounds, some healed on the surface, others still throbbing beneath, waiting for the right moment to bleed again. I took a deep breath, fighting the fear of losing everything again, and then, for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to be raw, imperfect, real. I said I was scared too. That there were nights I woke up startled, thinking it was better to let him go before something else in us broke. But I also said there was a part of me, that stubborn part, the one that survived all the losses, that still believed something good could grow even from the rubble. And that maybe, just maybe, what we had now was more genuine precisely because it came after the fall, after the wrong choices, after all the pain. Benjamin looked at me for a long moment, and in that tired gaze, there was a tenderness so weary, so human that my defenses dissolved without a fight. He extended his hand, and I took it in mine, feeling the silent strength of that gesture. Not like someone promising perfection, but like someone promising to try. We walked back without saying more, each carrying our scars, but also the timid beginning of a new hope, a hope more mature, more aware, born not of illusion, but of the daily choice to stay. That night, lying in bed as I listened to Benjamin's slow, steady breathing beside me, I understood something that changed everything inside me. Loving wasn't about never erring, never hurting, never doubting. Loving was, above all, about having the courage to stay, to reach out even knowing the risk, to ask for one more day and another. Until one day, without realizing, we had built something no fear could tear down anymore. The balance we built in the days that followed was as fragile as it was beautiful. A wrong gesture, a misplaced word, and everything could collapse. We knew that, and somehow that awareness made every moment even more precious. We were living in a kind of silent truce, as if both of us were afraid to touch the deeper wounds, and at the same time, knew that sooner or later we would have to. Loving in silence wasn't enough. Wanting in secret wasn't enough. To move forward, we needed to choose. We needed to look at what we had always avoided and decide if the love that still existed between us was strong enough to carry the scars too. The rupture came as quietly as it was brutal. We were sitting on the porch at dusk, sharing a thin blanket against the gentle chill that was beginning to settle. Benjamin was talking about a job opportunity in another city. Nothing urgent, nothing decided, just a possibility tossed into the air. But to me, that idea sounded like a veiled departure, as if even without saying it, he was still considering leaving, as if, despite everything, there was still a part of him that doubted the choice to stay. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt in a long time, not out of anger, not out of pride, out of fear, an old visceral fear of being left behind again. The words slipped out before I could filter them. If you're still thinking about going, then maybe you never really stayed. The silence that followed was so heavy, we could almost hear it spreading through the house, the furniture, the memories. Benjamin turned his face to the horizon, and for a moment I thought he would stand, grab the suitcase still resting in the back of the closet, and leave without looking back. But he didn't do any of that. He stayed there, motionless, his jaw tense, wrestling with something that seemed bigger than both of us. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and low, laden with a pain that unraveled me. I'm scared. Scared of staying and seeing everything break again. Scared of staying and not being enough for you. His words weren't an accusation. They were a confession. They were the exact portrait of what I felt too, but had never had the courage to admit. And it was in that moment, looking at the man I loved and seeing my own fear reflected in his eyes, that I understood. We weren't fighting against each other. We were fighting together against the weight of the past. I lowered my eyes, feeling the hot tears threatening to fall, but I didn't cry. I just reached out and placed my hand over his, squeezing it firmly like someone anchoring, like someone holding on to keep the other from getting lost. "I'm scared too," I whispered. "But if we wait until we're not anymore, we'll spend our whole lives waiting." Benjamin looked at me then, and in that weary gaze, there was something new. A silent surrender, a decision that didn't need grand gestures to be understood. There, on that cold porch, without grandiose promises, without vows of eternity, we made the hardest choice of all, to keep going, to accept that true love isn't made of the absence of fear, but of the courage to choose each other despite it. Choosing to keep going didn't erase the pain or magically rewrite our story. When the next morning arrived, bringing with it the soft, unrelenting light of new beginnings, there was still fear. There were still the marks of who we had been, throbbing beneath the skin like memories that refused to be forgotten. But there was also something we hadn't had before, the conscious choice to stay, to fight, to try. For the first time in a long while, I felt we were walking side by side, not just because of the love that still existed between us, but because of the mature decision to build something that could bear the weight of what we had already lived. And it was that choice, free, imperfect, courageous, that made everything different. Benjamin began to change in small gestures. He started making coffee before I even got out of bed, leaving the kitchen filled with that warm smell that reminded me that despite everything, there was care. We began sharing trivial tasks again, folding clothes, organizing books, making grocery lists. Simple things that from the outside seemed mundane, but for us, carried the silent weight of a renewed promise. The intimacy, the one that distance had nearly erased, began to stitch itself back together slowly, thread by thread, without urgency, without haste, like someone who understands that the strongest bonds are those that withstand the tides. I changed too. For the first time, I allowed myself to speak without measuring my words so much, without fear of seeming weak or inconvenient. I told Benjamin when I was scared, when I needed space, when I just wanted to be held without questions. And he, instead of pulling away as he had so many times before, learned to listen. He learned to stay. Sometimes we messed up, and we messed up badly. But now, instead of retreating to silence or anger, we stayed. We fought not against each other, but against everything that threatened to make us give up. And there was beauty in that imperfection. There was a new depth in looking at Benjamin and knowing he wasn't there out of impulse, convenience, or nostalgia. He was there because he chose to be. Because after all the weight, after all the doubts, there was still something in us worth preserving. And day by day, as we built a new routine over the rubble of what had nearly destroyed us, I understood that true love isn't measured by perfect days. It's measured by the daily decision to keep going, to stay, even when it would be easier to leave. And so slowly and without fanfare, we began to find each other again. As the days passed, the feeling of walking on thin ice was gradually replaced by something firmer, more reliable. We still had our moments of uncomfortable silence. There were still those old shadows that sometimes arose without warning, bringing painful memories to the surface. But now, instead of pulling back, we held on to each other. We chose to stay, even when insecurity knocked at the door. And it was in those moments, precisely the most fragile ones, that I felt how much we had grown. The love we were rebuilding wasn't a repetition of the past. It was something entirely new, born of acceptance, truth, and the painful yet beautiful awareness of those who have known loss up close and still choose to love again. There was one afternoon in particular that stayed etched in me like a silent anchor. We were in the backyard, planting some flowers in the small bed near the fence. The work was simple, almost banal, but there was a lightness in that moment that drew a spontaneous smile from me. As Benjamin arranged the lavender seedlings in the soil, getting his hands dirty without ceremony, I felt a tenderness so deep I had to look away to keep from crying. That's how it was now. Life was rebuilding itself in small gestures, in silent complicities, in knowing glances over freshly turned earth. There were no formal declarations, no eternal promises. There was choice, presence, daily work, love woven in simplicity. At night, as we dined under the soft kitchen light, Benjamin pulled a small box from a drawer. Without haste, without a speech, he placed it on the table between us. Inside was a simple, delicate chain with a small leaf-shaped pendant. He didn't say it was a gift of reconciliation or ask me to interpret it as a promise. He just smiled, that crooked, beautiful smile he had when he couldn't hide what he felt. I took the necklace with trembling hands, and as I ran my finger over the cool surface of the pendant, I felt something warm inside me, a silent certainty that we were at last where we were meant to be. Later, as he slept with his steady, rhythmic breathing beside me, I stared at the dark bedroom ceiling, feeling the light weight of the chain on my chest, and it was there, in the shared darkness, that I understood that love didn't save us because it was perfect. Love triumphed because we chose to save it. We chose to stay. We chose to start over, even without guarantees. We chose to give ourselves the right to be imperfect, and, even so, worthy of happiness. And maybe, I thought, smiling in the dark, that was what truly defined love's victory, not the absence of flaws, but the stubborn presence of hope, even when everything said it would be easier to give up. Life, like a river flowing unhurriedly, now seemed to move more calmly between us. Not that we were free of challenges, far from it. There were days when the ghosts of the past rose and whispered in the dark corners of our home, reminding us of old wounds. But now, instead of pulling apart, we drew closer. Every shared glance, every broken silence, was a small construction on the foundations we were creating. We weren't the same as before. That love, broken and rebuilt, no longer had the same contours. It was softer, stronger, more real. On a spring afternoon, in the garden that was now ours, Benjamin surprised me again. He prepared a simple picnic, with a blanket spread over the grass, and invited me to share it. It wasn't a grand celebration, but a silent gesture, an unspoken thank you felt in every detail. We sat there, eating sandwiches and drinking wine, as if we were in a place of our own, free from the weight of past expectations. And in that moment, I realized something simple but profound. Love, to be true, doesn't need grandiose promises. It lives in the details, in the daily choices, in the small things we do for each other without expecting anything in return. Benjamin and I came to understand what it truly meant to be present. It was no longer about what we had or what we lost. It was about the now, the present we chose to live day by day. Sometimes the words of love that once felt so heavy and demanding now came naturally, unhurried, without pressure. "I love you," he said one night as we lay side by side in bed. There was no pomp, no declarations of eternity, just the softness of a simple, sufficient truth. And it was in that shared silence, in the effortlessly clasped hands, that I realized what we had built together needed nothing more to be perfect. Life with Benjamin was now made of silent gestures, of trust, of presence. There were no more promises of forever, only the certainty that, as long as we were together, there would always be one more day to live, and that, with a light and full heart, was what I chose. To live not for the idea of a perfect future, but for the possibility that as long as we're here, there will always be room for one more day of love. The decision to ask him to stay on that distant day wasn't just about starting over. It was about realizing that even after so much time, there was still something in us worth saving. And in saving it, we discovered that love isn't a fairy tale. It's a real story, full of mistakes but also of rediscoveries, of growth, of choices made with every new dawn.